A robodog is something that you might see on an episode of a sci-fi show like The Black Mirror
Yeah.
or The Minority Report maybe. It's a four-legged quadruped military-grade piece of technology that has been announced by the Department of Homeland Security.
As a refugee, I can in a way understand when a government wants some information from me when I go to their country because it's their country. But what I don't understand is something that you mentioned. You said tech doesn't just stay at the border. That scares me a lot.
Those border hunters group, people who are the true believers in securing their homeland and just driving along the border, trying to hunt for refugees and migrants and asylum seekers.
There's been, a documented increase in the number of deaths since the introduction of the smart border kind of wall system at the US-Mexico corridor, right?
Welcome everyone to another episode of Fractured Podcast. Today we have with us special guest Petra Molnar. She is a lawyer and an anthropologist specializing in migration and human rights. And she's also the author of the amazing book, The Walls Have Eyes, Surviving Migration in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Welcome with us, Petra.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be with you.
Were you inspired by the movie The Hills Have Eyes for the title?
No,
Really?
I wish I could say that.
Have you seen that
But
movie?
it was
I
actually
watched it so many years ago. It still gives me nightmares. Like I cannot. That would we watch it together. Oh my god, that movie is horrible. Go.
It's very not thematic to what we're going to talk about, but this is actually a little bit maybe relating to Rashid's question, because you did this research for your book for 6 years, but I know you as a lawyer, as an immigration lawyer. So I was really wondering how you came across this topic. You were not really working in this area. This was not your research area, not your work area. How did you decide to dig so deep into this topic?
Yeah, that's a great question to start with, because it's like many of these things, kind of a happy accident or an interesting accident, because it's not necessarily a happy topic. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm an immigration and refugee lawyer by training and also an anthropologist, but not a tech person. I really didn't have much to do with technology up until I started doing this work, and my knowledge around those topics was really limited. Like, we're talking Wikipedia level knowledge of what is AI or what is an algorithm. Because I'm sure, like you, right? Like when we see so many difficult things happening in migration, like deportations, all the violence, all the discrimination, you're like, why should I care about drones or AI or these new technologies? But it was through this event that we held at work back in Canada back in 2018, where we were starting to ask some questions about technology and power and how it's impacting marginalized communities. That's when it opened up my eyes to trying to understand it from an immigration perspective. And back in 2018, my colleague Lex Gill and I, we discovered that the Canadian government at the time was using algorithmic decision making and different kinds of tools to automate our immigration system without public knowledge or discussion or scrutiny. And we were really concerned about that and wrote a report about it. And no one was more surprised than me at how much attention this work started getting. And it opened up my own eyes to this kind of intersection of tech and migration. Mm-hmm. And that's what brought me to write the book eventually.
Mm-hmm. So 6 years of research, how difficult was it actually to get access to those information? I can imagine that some of this is public, but in my knowledge or lack of knowledge, most of it would not be, officially announced until like it's done, it's finalized, and there is some kind of a consensus on using those technologies.
Yeah, I mean, access is a major issue in this area. I mean, with immigration decisions and kind of policies generally anyways, but when you then overlay the technology on it, it really makes it difficult to get access to just even the parameters of what projects are being used, what priorities are kind of being pushed forward, and even just literally physical access into the spaces. But because while doing this book and this work, I've had the luxury of time, taking years to be able to go and live in Greece, for example, for nearly 3 years, spending a lot of time in the spaces where technology is being tested out. Access does become easier through relational kind of building, right? And
Mm-hmm.
being able to be there and connect with journalists, with researchers, with people on the move made that possible. And I should also say, I've definitely noticed a trend of curtailing even more access now, because when I was doing a lot of the work, for example, in Greece on Samos and Lesbos and other spots where this technology is being tested out, back in 2021 and 2022, it was still somewhat possible to get access into the refugee camps or some of the border regions, which now has become much more difficult. And even being able to ask a government, what kind of technology they're using, or go to even the private sector conferences that I would go to sometimes to see a lot of this technology firsthand, something that was possible, 3, 4 years ago, has become nearly impossible for researchers or media to even access those spaces. So there's definitely a trend of making it more difficult to even get a sense of what's happening on the ground.
I'm just sorry. I'm just at the start of your book, and the more I read, the more I'm just getting shocked after every page. And one of the first thing that shocked me is the thing you talk about data colonialism, and you call it the new oil. And then you call it the silicon savannah. So can you tell us about that?
Sure. So this is one of the specific chapters that kind of broadened out the focus beyond border surveillance and technologies, like drones and other types of cameras and infrastructure like that, to more also trying to understand the power dynamics between countries that are obsessed with gathering data and parts of the world that are kind of acting as these larger laboratories of data collection. And a lot of this maps onto colonial lines of power and privilege. And the space that I was doing this work from was Kenya and the Kenya Somalia border region in particular, because Kenya has been experimenting with introducing digital identity systems into the administration of public life. And so there's this kind of other gloss to it too, where the majority of my work critiques technology as being kind of this tool of oppression and power. But there's also the other side where digital disenfranchisement is also something to think about. So communities being shut out from public administration, identity, ability, to gain access to healthcare or social services because they don't have access to a digital identity system. And that phrase, data is the new oil, actually comes from a colleague of mine, Mariam Jamal, who is a social justice and digital rights activist in Kenya. And I thought it really so nicely kind of captured what is really going on, the fact that data and information is also being monetized in this kind of capitalist system, where technology is playing a major part in this.
Mhm.
Mm.
A side note about what you said, that also when you are deprived from all of those new technologies, when it comes to even ID, any type of documents, there's a very interesting report that just came out, I think, by Lighthouse Reports. They investigated how it actually is in several African countries that were forced by the big organizations like World Bank to introduce some kind of biometric systems for their IDs, documents, for their election system, and what a negative impact this could actually have on those countries, and actually has, because sometimes the money came and got lost. The money is nowhere to be found. So there's some kind of a corruption involved in this. But also that the system got so complicated, but the infrastructure was not ready. So it's a gigantic issue for them that they are forced to do it because otherwise they wouldn't get the support from, let's say, World Bank. But they're not ready. There's not enough know-how to do certain things.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been a lot of critique of digital ID systems, specifically along these kind of parameters, the fact that they are imposed upon communities that maybe don't have, access to the resources to actually get this stuff off the ground, or even actually think about the kind of ramifications of what this is doing. For example, in the Kenya case, there's the big issue of double registration that happens, where a person might first be registered in a refugee database, and then when they try and get regularized or maybe marry a Kenyan citizen and then try and get access into the digital ID database, they are shut out of it completely because they're basically non-existent, right, in the kind of data sense. And that's such a clear kind of example again of how, even though these projects might be designed with a kind of good intention, right, identity and
Hmm.
giving people access to state services, what actually happens on the ground is very different. Or even a more granular example that I often think about, and I think this applies to biometrics generally, right? I mean, biometrics, that's a broad class of data that has a lot to do with your body. So it's things like iris scanning, fingerprinting, even like a vein pattern or the way you walk. But if you're dealing, for example, with agrarian communities or people who, work a lot with their hands, sometimes they don't have fingerprints to actually even register in the systems in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, again, that highlights like how this technology is even being developed and thought about, right? And who's in the room to consult and discuss how this is actually going to play out on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
As a refugee, I can, in a way, understand when a government wants some information from me when I go to their country because it's their country. But what I don't understand is something that you mentioned. You said tech doesn't just stay at the border. That scares me a lot. So how is it? How is this data used in the mainland to control and survey refugees and migrants?
Yeah, that's such a good point because, so much of this technology might start at the border or in spaces of humanitarian emergency, but it filters into other facets of life. And not only from the perspective of technology that's really kind of draconian and difficult, like drones, right, being tested out at the border and then all of a sudden being used to surveil protesters, for example, but also just even the collection of data and the kind of data that's shared by immigration enforcement with law enforcement, for example, inland once a person already arrives, or the scraping of social media, for example, of people on the move and refugees and those who work with them for all sorts of risk profiles and purposes that are oftentimes, again, not public. So it again, I think, shows how even just the concept of the border is not really just the border
Yeah.
anymore, the kind of physical location, but it rather filters outwards, right, and inwards into a country as well. And technologies really exacerbate that and make it even possible for people to be surveilled basically 24/7.
So can we talk a little bit about like specific examples of this tech? Because I have to say that this was an eye-opening book because I started researching more about this situation because normally till recently when we speak about border technology, it's like drones that is the first thing that comes to my mind. And it's obvious that it has been happening for years. I remember when I worked at the border between Serbia and Hungary, 2016. So this was the new thing that the drones came to this border and it was patrolled by it, like not that many soldiers along the border anymore. And it seemed like that's technologically very advanced. And now you mentioned some things, but there are those now famous. I actually didn't know about them, but the robo-dogs. You mentioned the technology of media scraping or this voice printing software. Can you tell us a little bit of what do those things do? How do they work? Where are they used?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a vast area, right? Because there's so many technologies now that basically impact a person's migration journey before they even move, while they're at the border, and then when they're in the country that they're going to. I mean, and it's a massive collection of different projects. Some are like we've been talking about, the kind of more traditional surveillance that people might think of. So the drones, the blimps that fly around, thermal cameras, walls with sensors, but definitely there is this proliferation of almost like sci-fi kind of tools. And you mentioned robodogs. I mean, that to me is one of the more visceral examples that I try and cover in the book. A robodog is something that you might see on an episode of a sci-fi show like The Black Mirror
Yeah.
or The Minority Report, maybe. It's a four-legged quadruped military-grade piece of technology that has been announced by the Department of Homeland Security back in the spring of 2022 to kind of join the global arsenal of border technologies at the US-Mexico corridor. Although, interestingly enough, there were also some pilot projects in the European Union years before that we came across. So clearly, the two regions have been kind of communicating with one another or learning from one another at the very least. But it's really disturbing when you think of this kind of technology, right? Autonomous, four-legged, chasing people who are crossing the Sonora Desert, for example. And I think it should kind of instill fear or deep discomfort in us, because it also then maps onto what we were just talking about, the fact that these technologies don't actually stay at the border. Because a year after the Department of Homeland Security announced that the robodogs would be rolled out at the US-Mexico corridor, the New York City Police Department announced that they wanted to use robodogs on the streets of New York. One was even painted white with black spots on it, like a Dalmatian. Really, really disturbing. And you also mentioned, things like voice printing and other types of tools. Those are the kind of tools that are used once a person's already in a country, for example, and might be going up for an asylum case. And at first blush, it seems like maybe this is a good idea. It might make the systems more efficient. But actually, when you look at it, right, from like a refugee lawyer perspective or a human perspective, we can see that there's issues with the ways that these technologies are experienced. We know, for example, that languages and accents are something that's very socially coded and can actually change throughout the course of your day, right? How you speak, who you speak with. And yet, we have these tools now that, for example, the German government has been using to try and say, well, based on this voice print that we have, this person might be from the Daraa province in Syria, but in a previous hearing, they said that they're from Aleppo, therefore they're lying, therefore, there goes their refugee case.
What?
And so again, to me, it's always important to interrogate it from the kind of social perspective of what the technology is actually doing in the current context. And if we know that the migration system is inherently discriminatory, very difficult for people on the move, and now we have all these new technologies and tools that are kind of, again, exacerbating the power differential, that's, to me, the really the big thing to interrogate here.
I just want to add something about the robodogs. Really, it's like you're talking about something coming out of the movie Terminator. So from the book, from Petra's book, they obey human commands. And the Australians, they managed to connect with them with a headset. So you wear a headset, and telepathically you communicate with them. So you don't even tell them what you're gonna do. They have to do. You just think of it and they do it. Something else, and they are saying they are developing their own personalities. Imagine you put this thing and you put on it weapons, and you tell it to chase brown people, and what do you expect the personality to be? A psychopath will go and kill. This is how dangerous it is.
It was actually very hard for me to imagine how this works, in practice. How do you control those robodogs? What are they really capable of? I was just again thinking about the Serbian-Hungarian border, and there were lots of dogs at this border, but their role wouldn't be the same, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the concern with a tool like the RoboDog is, again, it's kind of expanding the ability of a human officer to do their job. And so if we know that this piece of technology, doesn't need to drink water, doesn't need to sleep, it can, run across really difficult terrain, kind of, again, expanding the border further and further afield in this kind of growing surveillance dragnet, so to speak. It's just really concerning to see the kind of exponential ability to support the kind of practices that are already happening. Not to mention the kind of automated decision-making elements that go into it, right? And the fact that we know that sometimes these robodogs can even be armed. So we can all imagine what might happen at the border if that's the case, and these machines are making the decisions.
Actually, the automation of the decision-making process, this is actually the very, very scary part for me, that we think that certain things can go smoother and be actually easier because of that, but we're leaving it in the hands of a tool, basically. So now the tool is responsible for making the decisions.
Yeah, totally. And this is kind of an undercurrent that runs through the whole book. this idea that automation and introduction of these new technologies actually, again, kind of exacerbates the power differentials between the powerful actors who make decisions and the people on whom the decisions are made. And it's important, I think, again, to kind of go back to the context, right? And you guys know this more than anyone. The system is so set up, right, to presuppose that a refugee is a liar unless proven
Oh
otherwise,
yeah.
a fraud or a threat, right? Those are the kind of logics that underpin the way that immigration decisions get made. And we know there's so much opacity and discretion in the way that officers are making decision, right? From a legal perspective, you can give two officers the exact same set of evidence and they can render two completely different yet equally legally valid determinations. So if this is the kind of space in which decisions get made, what happens when we start automating, either partially or fully, this kind of decision making process?
Mm-hmm.
The concern, I think, from a legal perspective is that people can hide behind automated decisions, right? It's like, well, the computer told me no, therefore there must be some validity to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than actually looking at the fact that, these systems are socially created, they replicate biases. They are not necessarily any more objective or efficient or fair than a human decision maker, right? Not to say that the system is great and should stay the same, but the answer to a broken system like isn't a band-aid solution that's going to make it worse. And that's what this automation kind of fervor or obsession seems to be doing.
What most people don't know or don't want to know, maybe, where are these technologies coming from? And I think in chapter 4 you said all roads lead to Jerusalem, and you said that AI powered towers are the creation of Elbyte Systems, a controversial Israeli company that tests these things in Palestine. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I mean, Israel is a major player in the kind of global economy that has grown up around border technologies and military grade technologies that are used for border enforcement. Um, and it's important to pay attention to this player because of this kind of normalization of the tech that's first tested out in occupied Palestinian territories and then sold for profit to the European Union or the United States, like the AI towers that you're mentioning by Elbit Systems, but also the Heron drones that patrol the Mediterranean and Aegean corridor, and other types of surveillance technology too that we've seen that has Israeli links, that's weaponized against journalists and critics and people on the move themselves. Um, for me, it was really important to include a section on Israel and actually to go to the occupied West Bank in the spring of 2023 to try and get a sense of what these technologies of apartheid are doing. And this is also building on work, for example, of an amazing book called The Palestine Laboratory by journalist Anthony Lewinstein. He's a Jewish Australian journalist who wrote this book a few months ago, and it basically details how the Israeli state has become, the major purveyor of surveillance technology around the world. I zeroed in on the kind of border tech elements of it, but it was really very eye-opening and life-changing on some way to see just how these technologies of coercion and control were used back then, not to mention an amplification since October 7th, right? A year ago, the genocide in Gaza started. And it's, I think it's quite telling that we're talking today because to me, it just again highlights like how war, technology, migration, fear, all kind of are bound up together in this ecosystem where a lot of powerful actors are trying to make money off of it and profiteer off of human suffering. And that's something that you really see in the way that Israel is using technology.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Israel as like all the roads lead to Israel where the technologies are produced, but you mentioned also other borders where there are those big like basically test labs for all of those places. You mentioned Greece. I would assume U.S.-Mexico border is one. Maybe now Polish-Belarusian border. Are there like borders that are like always like for sure the ones that will test those new things and are the new frontier?
Yeah, I mean, I think the frontiers are the ones definitely where this kind of high risk laboratory of tech has been proliferating. U.S. Mexico definitely, because That's also such a major election issue, right? And massive amounts of money are being pumped into that border system to test out different smart walls, different sensors, robodogs, AI towers. Frontiers of the EU, absolutely. I mean, Greece has been kind of at the vanguard, so to speak, oftentimes referred to as Europe's shield in European policy documents, right? It's very, very clear what's going on there. Also, massive amounts of money from the European Union being funneled into Greece for surveillance and surveillance testing. Yeah, definitely, it's interesting too that you mentioned the Polish-Belarusian border, because after the Lukashenko regime was weaponizing migration and trapping people in that corridor for months at a time, and recently once again, reports came out that the Polish government was wanting to learn from Greece to use some of the surveillance technology that's being tested out in Evros and on some of the islands, and then repurpose it for the Polish-Belarusian border. So there's a lot of learning that happens between different jurisdictions as well, and because this is a kind of regional and a global goal to introduce as much technology and as much surveillance into migration control as possible.
My just personal comment about this, because when the fence at the Serbian Hungarian border was built, and Hungary would allow themselves to just use any type of technologies, but also use a lot of violence at those at their border. They got a lot of criticism from the European Union, from member states, from the European Commission. And it is really ironic that instead of building better systems to manage the situation and the crisis better, it went more Hungarian way. So basically, violence is present at every single almost European border, for sure the external borders. And those technologies that were used, this is being moved as well and tested at other borders, but also, creating of those, we were just discussing those border hunters group, people who are the true believers in securing their homeland and just driving along the border, trying to hunt for refugees and migrants and asylum seekers. It's just sad that it went this way, something that was really criticized, that went against European Union values, now is the new norm.
For sure. And, I think this is unfortunately a global phenomenon, right? That we're seeing in Canada, in the US, in Australia, in the EU, these politics of fear that animate so much of the decision making that gets made when it comes to migration, and also using these kind of framings, right, of people on the move as the ultimate other, as the group that is coming, to take over the West, right? I mean, it's so obvious when you start picking apart the kind of logics that underpin why certain decisions get made. And also these like short-sighted ways of thinking about migration, right? Rather than looking at the root causes of conflict and what is forcing people to move, right? We're thinking instead of deterrence, right? Making the journeys as difficult as possible so that people don't come. This is, a common argument that I see even with smart border technologies. States say, well, we need this to prevent people from making dangerous journeys. That doesn't work. What it does is it forces people to actually take journeys through more difficult terrain, whether through Evros, whether through, different parts of the Sonor Desert. There's been, a documented increase in the number of deaths since the introduction of the smart border kind of wall system at the US-Mexico corridor, right? So it's just these kind of short-sighted ways of looking at human migration, which is something that's been with us since, day one of humanity. People have always been moving. And yet now, because it's, again, this kind of politics of fear that animates everything, it really gives rise to this increasingly sharpened system. And that's where the digital technologies kind of come in. They make it as difficult as possible for people to be able to exercise their human rights and move.
Okay, so Petra, I have to ask you, because we had a very fiery discussion in the studio about the robodogs.
People are betting here.
Yeah. How do they look like? Because apparently they can have heads. They not necessarily have like real heads. So they may look like the ones from the Black Mirror episode. They may not. And like, what is there like? What do they do specifically? Right? You put this robodog at the border. Should it predominantly monitor? Is its job to stop people from crossing? If so, how exactly? What are they? What are they weaponized in?
Yeah, so the RoboDog basically, I mean, it's interesting that we're calling it a RoboDog because really it's like a four-legged robot basically, and colloquially it's become known as a dog, but it, could be a cat, could be anything else. But it basically has four legs, and it's able to scale difficult terrain, much more easy than a human might, for example. There's other types of robots that if you Google, Boston Dynamics, for example, one of the companies that was the first to be putting these kind of things together. You'll notice that some of them are taller, they can jump around, but again, it's this kind of idea that the robot is an autonomous piece of technology that can then be deployed for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes they're used, for firefighting or in situations of disaster to assist people who are in distress where maybe a human would not be able to go. But at the border, the concern is that, again, they're going to be there for the purposes of border monitoring and control and kind of augmenting the surveillance that already exists there and also the work that human officers are doing. But, in full transparency, it's actually difficult to know what the parameters of these RoboDog projects actually is like, because since the announcement from the Department of Homeland Security, getting access to really granular pieces of information in terms of like how many dogs, where are they deployed, are they armed, what are they actually doing is very, very difficult to come by. Although just as recently as this spring, there was a big conference called the Border Expo in Texas. And my colleague Todd Miller, who's a journalist who's been doing amazing work in Arizona, he went to the Border Expo and saw that RoboDogs were there from AT&T and Verizon, two big telco companies in the United States. Everyone's in on it.
Wow. And just for people to understand, US buys this technology and put it on the border, US Mexico. And you mentioned in your book they even put it next to the indigenous people land. You mentioned they are violating the land of, I hope I get it right, the Tohono O'odham Nations Reservation located in Arizona. So they just pushing it further and further. So, and you mentioned in your book also you met James from Battalion Rescue and Search, and we're gonna have him also on the podcast after. So, how is it? How does it look like? How dangerous the situation for immigrants who are crossing from Mexico to the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, the Sonora Desert is such a beautiful part of the world, but it's so deadly. Similar to the Aegean and Mediterranean Sea, like there's something so beautiful about it, but so difficult. And when you spend time there, you really realize that it is this kind of place that makes people disappear in a way. And to get a sense of that, I was really lucky to have met James Holman, who started the Battalion Search and Rescue, one of the kind of Samaritan groups that operates in Arizona to assist people in distress, drop water, sometimes find human remains. And as an aside, I find the Arizona context so interesting because so many of these groups are often run by 70 or 80-year-olds,
Mm-hmm.
retirees who could instead be on a sun lounger, but they're choosing to go into the desert to assist people on the move. I find that such a moving and fascinating kind of context to try and understand. But while working with James, I got a chance to go into the desert. Took us about 3 hours or so to hike into the Sonora, and we visited the memorial site of a young man. His name was Mr. Elias Alvarado, and he was a husband and father from Central America, who came in search of a better life and unfortunately died only kilometers away from a major highway. And being in those spaces, I just couldn't help but reflect on the fact that maybe people like Mr. Elias Alvarado will be chased by robodogs in that area, because that was the surreal moment that still stays with me. It was right around the time in February of 2022 when we were at this memorial site that the Department of Homeland Security announced the robodogs. And so you have this kind of tension there, the solidarity, the togetherness, people trying to show up for one another and honor the people who have died making these dangerous crossings, while the US government is augmenting the border surveillance complex with with robodogs.
Mhm. Going back maybe a little bit to our European playground here, um, you mentioned that some of those new technologies are being financed by the EU. And in your book, you're also mentioning this project called iBorder Control. And first of all, I was wondering how does it really work? But the other issue here is I am assuming because most of those projects are financed by massive financial tools that European Union has at its disposal. So it's all publicly announced as like European Union has to do, but they're simply not bragging about working on certain technologies. So while doing a research, one can just be a little bit of be simply confused. What is this grant for? Because it's written sometimes in this very convoluted way. So I wanted to ask you about your opinions about like the relation with the new technology to the EU funds.
Yeah, that's such an important question, the kind of following the money, so to speak, because in the European Union in particular, it's fascinating and disturbing how much of this happens under the guise of these research projects, right? Like you're mentioning Horizon 2020 projects like the iBorder Control project, which I can get into in a bit. But it like to me, it just highlights how so much of this is hidden under this kind of veneer of it just being research or a pilot project, and then not having to have the kind of same obligations of disclosure for the public in terms of what the parameters of that work really is, what is it doing, where is it heading. So even though there is ways to, for example, look up different projects that are being funded, it's the parameters of them and the scale and even whether or not a human rights impact assessment was made, none of that is clear. And the iBorder Control project, I think, is a great example to try and understand this kind of weird, convoluted environment through. It's essentially, it was billed as an AI lie detector. I'm using that a bit loosely because, we could have an entire conversation about like whether or not this even works because it's been essentially debunked as snake oil technology. But it purported to be able to use facial recognition and emotion recognition software to make determinations about whether or not a person was telling the truth about their migration story before being screened for secondary screening at different borders. And interestingly enough, the three pilot sites that were proposed were Latvia, which was okay, Hungary, and Greece. So major interdiction points, right, for people who are on the move and coming into Europe. But so we know that like AI lie detection doesn't even work, that it is this kind of sci-fi thing that people are obsessed with trying to figure out, right? This kind of yet again having another tool to try and make determinations about complex human behavior. But like from a refugee lawyer perspective, like first of all, we know that the traditional lie detectors, like the ones that go back and forth like this, that you might see on CSI or some other show, they're oftentimes not even allowed as evidence in court of law, right? So like why are we developing AI lie detectors? And how can an AI lie detector deal with differences in cross-cultural communication, for example? Like I've worked with people in court when I used to practice that didn't make eye contact with a judge of the opposite gender, maybe because of religion or nerves, Or what about the impact of trauma on memory and the fact that we know that we tell stories in a linear way anyway? Like human judges struggle with this. Why are we developing AI lie detectors to muddy the kind of conversation further?
There's this
And if I
notion
can
that AI will do it better than humans, even though they learn from our experience, right?
Exactly. And if the starting point is that refugees and people at the border are liars and therefore must be kind of rooted out, right? And if that's the starting point, then obviously those biases around human behavior are going to be baked into the system. And with the iBorder Control project in particular, to me, it was so eye opening to actually talk to some of the people who were behind designing this project, including a university in the UK, which I think is important because academics, as someone who has one foot in academia, I think it's important to always critique academics. We play a major role in legitimizing this kind of tech too. And I spent some time talking with these people and I said, like, how did this come to be? And they were quite distressed because there was an Intercept article that was written about the iBorder Control project and kind of lambasting it for being basically a total failure. And they said, well, we just didn't think about it. We didn't think about it from this perspective. I'm like, did you not talk to a single refugee lawyer or a refugee while designing this project, right, you just decided that this was something to do. And it highlighted again to me like the kind of priorities that take precedence when it comes to developing tech. Because we could be using AI to root out racist border guards, but
Hmm.
instead we're liars at the border. And that's a normative choice that I think we have to query.
Let's go to the neighbor in the North, Canada. And I read an article, I think you wrote it, I'm not sure, about Canada's use of AI in immigration and refugee systems. And they are developing some kind of an algorithm that just, I cannot even understand it. And also, is it the same as what the US did since 2019? I think when they introduced this law, this thing about the visa, you have to include all your social media for the government to see for the last 5 years, and people were guilty by association. For example, you mentioned the Palestinian student that who he was denied the visa to go study there because his friend once said something on social media on Facebook against Israel. So you don't have to say stuff from the past. They can find even your friends what they said.
The link.
Yeah. So yeah, just can we focus on Canada and the algorithm they are using?
Yeah, so Canada, that's the place where all of this started for me because I was working as a lawyer there, and we came across this kind of project that the Canadian government was trying to introduce automated decision making or algorithms into our immigration system through what you could call visa triaging. So basically, they wanted to automate the way that visas from certain countries were being thought about and how decisions were being made through automation, basically. And the concern there was like a lot of this wasn't public. We found out about it quite by accident as a result of an access to information request that we asked the government for, as one does in this area. And you come up with all sorts of things that are not public. But it really showed just how much appetite there is on part of, so-called receiving countries like Canada to automate and make the system more efficient through these untested and high risk technologies. And since then, yeah, I mean, Canada, again, as a place that has been hosting large numbers of people, both in the immigration stream as well as the asylum and refugee stream, there seems to be, again, this kind of appetite to introduce as much automation and technology as possible. So it's something that I'm tracking now through the lab that I work at. And also, we're trying to understand what's happening at the US Canada border, too, from a surveillance perspective, especially given the upcoming US election and how that might change people's migration journeys in the north as well. That's a bit of an open question because, again, so much of this is not public, but maybe I'll let you know in a year or two what we find
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, I guess US, Canada is something that you would not expect to be researching, right? This is something from The Handmaid's Tale. Like, this is the border to go through.
Yeah, and I mean we've already noticed, of course, upticks in numbers, right, of people coming into Canada, especially around 2016 and then even 2020. And unfortunately, people have died as well, because a lot of the border is, even though it maybe isn't patrolled in the same way that the US Mexico border is, the environment can be quite hostile, especially if you're moving in the middle of winter, right? And then people have lost their lives and sometimes limbs in the prairies where it can get very, very cold. And so it's really terrible to think that that's, again, like another frontier where more surveillance might be at play.
Mhm. When we're talking about all of those new technologies and AI, it is pretty obvious to us that they have been constructed, designed to simply stop migration, stop human flows, prove refugees that they lie, that they are not the desired people to be in the European Union. But I was thinking that given how problematic the system is, we witness it in Greece all the time, how one case can be claimed as a positive and somebody can get asylum, and another person can take the same case and decide that no, this person does not deserve asylum. So I was really thinking that those technologies should be used to make the system better, to to build a system actually, because it really doesn't work well. I don't know if you can think of any way that those new technologies can actually work in favor. It doesn't seem like they are designed to do that, to support the asylum process, to scan people truly with what we have right now in place. It doesn't seem like there are tools to do that.
Yeah, because, to me, technology is a lens through which to understand power and power differentials, right? And the kind of powerful actors that are behind the scenes making decisions that, yes, because migration is a problem, quote unquote, the solution is technology. The solution is a robodog or a drone or an AI lie detector. It's not thought of as a tool of empowerment or psychosocial support or legal support, right, for people on the move. And that's again, that's a normative choice. It's not necessarily about the technology, but rather how it actually is used. And so, I mean, definitely, I think there are ways that we all need to be thinking more, maybe imaginatively, how technology can actually be used to level this playing
Mm-hmm.
field, so to speak.
Yeah.
And maybe use AI again to audit immigration decision makers and not refugees,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or use technology that's designed by mobile communities for mobile communities, whether that's a specific chatbot or a social support technology or just even information sharing that can happen online in much more efficient ways. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, these are all kind of promising directions, I think,
Yeah.
at the intersection of tech and migration.
Yeah, because there are real problems. So many people come without documents. Either they didn't
Yeah.
take them, they forgot them, they lost them on the way, right? There must be a system that can help screening also people who come without documents. It is a real problem. Whether we believe that people have good intentions or not, the screening has to happen sometime, every time. It seems like using and designing technologies to support that system for the purpose of checking without this pre-notion that it's obvious that you're lying in this asylum process. That's something really worth investing in, and it would build the system. It would really ease the system instead of really focusing on getting everybody out of the country, out of the asylum system.
Yeah, I mean, it's again about the priorities, right? Like the priorities that drive what we innovate on and why. And even if just a fraction of this multi-billion-dollar border industrial complex, if a fraction of that was used, like you're saying, right, for technologies of assistance, of identification, of support. I mean, I just can't help but think back to when the Samos camp in Greece opened for the first time. I think it was September 2021. And I was there and I got to go on the official opening to see, this
Mm-hmm.
kind of high tech camp in action, so to speak. It was the first one out of the five that they've been planning. And it was crazy to see the kind of biometrics at the door, the drones, all this other stuff that's came out since. But that camp didn't have running water 2 weeks before opening, right? Like that is such a clear example of
Mm-hmm.
what priority precedence here. And yeah, of course, I mean, I think again, if we all banded together and said, well, we need technology to assist, with legal cases, with psychosocial support, that would be one way to try and push against this kind of system that presupposes that everybody is a threat that has to be pushed out, so much money being spent on border enforcement rather than actually making the system operate on like the basics of human dignity and fairness and transparency. That's just not the kind of starting point.
It just seems like it's a system to traumatize more the victims that come in from these countries. And I also read in your book about the application that the U.S. was working on. That people before going inside, they have to do this screen and stuff, and it crashes all the time. And you have to put a lot of stuff on it, and they don't know. You can, for example, you can put your application today, you get accepted. I'm waiting for 4 months there on the border. No, so nobody knows. There is no transparency there, and also.
If I can just
Go.
interrupt you, it's like now legal system in
Yeah.
Greece for more than a month. It's been suspended because they cannot handle the number of cases, even though there were times when there were many more cases in the system. But technology-wise, it cannot handle it.
Yeah. For me, before coming to Europe, I was ready to be discriminated against. People think I'm like I'm a criminal or something. I was it's okay. But I was saying to myself, as long I'm gonna be a good person like I was before, nothing's gonna happen. But now in the US, you go there, immediately you're a criminal. And you mentioned this in your book, the concept of crimi-
Immigration. Yeah.
criminalization of immigrants. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's another one of those kind of underpinnings in this whole system, right? Like this conflation between criminality and migration, and the assumption that when people are on the move, they are somehow criminal, they are somehow an other or a threat that has to be managed and controlled and made intelligible. And that's where the technology kind of comes in, right? That's why we are seeing so much more investment on surveillance, on scrutiny, on biometrics, and also on, yeah, like the applications you're mentioning that just don't work, like the CBP1 facial recognition app at the US Mexico border. At first blush it's like, okay, well, maybe this will work because it will make the system faster, more fair, whatever. But actually, in reality, it doesn't work at all. It crashes people's phones. It's very bad at registering people with darker skin. Nobody knows where the data is going. And so again, these kind of piecemeal interventions that again kind of exacerbate the foundational premise that a person on the move is a criminal unless proven otherwise. Like, I think that's what we need to kind of attack. That
Mm-hmm.
framing at the very outset and at the very heart of what goes into why we develop the technology the way we do, but even more broadly, why we make the migration policies the way we make them.
Mm-hmm. Petra, you didn't stop with your book when it comes to the issues of AI and technology. You created the Migration and Technology Monitor project, which I very much want to mention right now, and we'll put it on the screen because it's a really wonderful project that keeps us all updated to what is happening. So I would very much like to recommend it to everybody to have a look and potentially also contact you and add to it.
Oh, thanks for mentioning that. Yeah. So the Migration and Technology Monitor is something that we started with my colleague Tendai Achiume, who was then the UN Rapporteur on Discrimination back in 2020. And honestly, at first we thought it was going to be like another platform or a website to house some of this work on borders and surveillance and migration. But it grew into a community. And I think this really comes from my personal commitment of, trying to always make sure that the work we do not only has direct impact on the ground, but actually makes space for people on the move to tell their own stories on what's happening. And I know that's something that's at the heart of ReFOCUS Media Labs as well. And I'm such a fan of the work you do too, because of this framing. And that's something that we tried to do with the Migration Tech Monitor as well. And so we launched a fellowship program for people on the move in various areas of displacement around the world to kind of create this incubator for work on migration and tech. And it honestly, even selfishly, has just been such an amazing thing to witness because as someone who's been looking at the kind of sharpest, darkest edges of migration for a long time, you sometimes lose a little bit of hope in terms of like, where is this really going? Like, is the future robo-dogs and AI lie detectors? Like, maybe, but also there is all this joy and resistance and creativity that comes with technology too. And even though some of our fellows, look at some of the sharp edges of surveillance, surveillance of migrant workers, the CBP1 app, all sorts of other projects, others are looking at developing technology that actually is rights respecting and supportive of mobile communities, whether that's a chatbot for Venezuelan refugees or a psychosocial support application for Ugandan refugees. I mean, it's been amazing to see the kind of breadth of work and projects that people have been doing. And to me, it also maybe is a bit of an antidote to this kind of thinking around migration that is so deep personal, when it comes to technology, like reducing people to a data point or a fingerprint or an eye scan. The storytelling and the individual impacts, I think, are a really powerful way to get people thinking about what this is really doing on the ground. Not to mention also redistributing resources directly on the ground to mobile communities. That's a big kind of goal of ours as well. So that's what we've been up to at the Migration and Tech Monitor.
Cool.
And it's super important because I'm sorry to say it, but it's kind of given because it's technology that probably your book will not be very much updated anymore in like 5 years. It's going to go so much ahead, like with all the technologies, the development of new AI tools and so on. You will have to write another one probably in like 5 to 10 years, that for sure. But at least the Migration and Technology Monitor project keeps us updated on that.
All right. The US elections are coming. So, how do you think each camp will deal with immigration? And in your book, you mentioned that people thought that Trump's approach to immigration by building the wall, that was the worst thing. But you said that Biden's and Obama's administration have maybe caused more harm to immigrants passing by.
Good question. Yeah, I mean, this is very much an open topic of discussion, I think, in the lead up to the U.S. Election next month, and it's interesting to see, yeah, how both camps have been dealing with migration generally, but also surveillance and tech. And I think obviously the Trump administration's response to migration has been so horrific in so many ways, right? I mean, I think we all can remember the images of babies in
Mhm.
cages at the US Mexico border, and then all the horrible things that have happened. So I don't want to minimize that, but I think it's very important to also critique what the Democratic administrations have been doing, not only in terms of, the kind of actions outside of US territory, but also specifically what's happening at the US Mexico border and the normalization of tech and smart borders, kind of as a humane way, quote unquote, as an antidote to the Trump wall, which is a framing that we often see in policy documents. And yet, like we were talking before, right, there's been, I think, a nearly tripling of deaths since the introduction of the smart border system at the US Mexico border, a system that was introduced by the Democrats. So I think it's an open question very much in terms of, yeah, I mean, first of all, who's going to win the election, and also what kind of stance they're going to take on migration largely, but border technology specifically. And I think when it comes to the possible Harris administration, we just don't really know what the parameters of their policymaking on migration are to be. So
Hmm.
I think it unfortunately is very much an open question still.
I read that your next book is gonna talk about community resistance. So, can you tell us about the next project, your next book?
Sure, yeah. So it kind of will pick up on the last chapter of The Walls of Eyes, the one that's a little bit more hopeful because the rest of the
Okay.
book I know is a little dystopic. But also, again, dystopia only tells a part of the story. And so I really want to create space for conversations around resistance, around showing up for one another, and kind of using the concept of care as an understanding of how we show up for one another in this increasingly kind of techified world, so to speak. So I think it'll follow a similar pattern, but it will be a little bit more joyful, hopefully, to read too.
Okay. Your question about migration and technology, is it the same as the fellowship program you recently launched, or no?
Yeah, that's
Oh,
right.
okay, it's
That's
the
right. So
same.
the
Okay.
fellowship program sits within the
Hmm.
Migration Technology
Okay.
Monitor.
Cool, cool. That's it from me. I only don't have questions because I haven't finished the book. Otherwise,
Oh,
I will have
he
a
admitted.
pile of
To
questions.
to defense, it's not that easy to get the book in Europe.
Yeah,
No.
Barnes and Nobles were so racist. They were like, "You're in Greece, you cannot get it." They took my money, so yeah. So I checked in my
Oh
bank account.
no.
It left an hour later. They say we cannot sell you in Greece. I'm like, my
Oh, that's not
money.
good.
So I had to go around many stuff. So yeah, but I got it. Yeah, at the end. Yeah,
Oh,
it's
I
just
should have I should have sent you an online copy or a hard copy. Actually, I'll bring some with me to Athens when I
yeah. So
come
when
next.
you come, yeah, bring
when
and
are you
signed
coming?
one.
Well, hopefully early in the year. I was just there in August for my birthday. I still have an apartment in Kypseli, so
Oh,
and
Keep
I'm
Sally.
hoping to
Wow.
spend more time. Are you guys there now, or are you in Berlin?
no, we are now in Athens. Doug and I
Athens.
were going to Berlin actually tomorrow via
Oh,
Warsaw, a
nice.
long way. Yeah, because we're opening in Berlin, but
Yeah,
for
I
now,
heard.
this is
That's
our
amazing.
home. Yeah,
Yeah,
not far from Kypseli.
Yeah, we invite you
that's
to
great.
come to we invite you to come to the office and maybe teach a workshop here with our
Oh, I would
students.
love that.
Yep.
Absolutely. Of
We have
course.
very passionate students
Yeah,
that want to learn journalism and stuff. Yeah, so if you can help,
amazing. Actually,
cool.
sorry, not to give you more work, but you might be interested in this as well. One of our fellows that we currently have at the Monitor, her name is Mona Steya. She usually lives in Ramallah, but she is in my apartment in Kipseli now for a little bit of a break.
Hmm.
Oh,
She's been doing some work, like really amazing work on like the tech that's being used in the West Bank and kind of
Is
big
it
private
is
actors
it
as well.
Stavrola?
No, her
Ah,
name
okay,
is
because
Mona.
I all right.
Mona Steya. She's a Palestinian activist. In case you wanted to do another interview, she's going to be in Kipseli for the next couple weeks. So I can put
Yeah,
you in touch with her.
Interesting.
She's great.
yeah. Can you send me her contacts?
Of course, yeah.
Ooh, amazing.
Petra, I feel like we could talk about this topic forever, ever, especially if we
Yeah.
go into details of robodogs and those all those scanning apps. And thank you very much for giving us your
Thank
time to
you.
explain this situation. I'm pretty sure we will be asking you for more updates about that.
And we're gonna put the link to your book in the description.
Yep.
Can we do that? Yeah.
Of course.
Cool.
Thank you so much for
Amazing.
having me, and it was such a pleasure to
Thank
reconnect.
you.
I can't wait to see you in person
Yeah.
again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.